Bakemonogatari is one of those rare stories that communicates a number of piercing truths about the human condition, about the importance of but also the complexity of human relationships and the roles that friendship, love, sexuality, power, spirituality, and trauma can play in our lives. It is a story that so spoke to some of my most difficult past experiences that in a way I see it as a roadmap about how not to make some of the same mistakes that I imagine a few others have made in life. Today I want to talk about one of the first moral lessons that Bakemonogatari communicates to us about trauma. To do so, I'm going to take a critical look at the first arc of the show, the Hitagi Crab arc, which is about Hitagi Senjohara's journey to accept rather than repress or project the trauma of her mother's past actions upon her life. But before I get ahead of myself, cue the intro.
Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a bumpy night.
Hey everybody, what's up? This is your boy, the Mahogany Machine, aka TropicalRobot, and this is actually my first ever YouTube video, so I really hope that you enjoy this one. And if you do, please feel free to leave a like, a comment, and most importantly, fam, please hit that subscribe button and click on the notifications bell so that you're alerted of any new content that's going to come out either from myself or from my fellow otakutarians, Base, TexasRangerShaw, and Silver. And if you like our content, please also feel free to follow our podcast, Anime Ramblin' Boys. It's available on whatever podcasting platform you could possibly imagine, and it's actually very similar to what we do here. It's anime analysis from a critical perspective. The only difference is that it's in a more free-form style, and so you'll actually have episodes available to you about shows like Konosuba, Fate Zero, and The Promised Neverland. And if you can, fam, I personally would greatly appreciate this, as I've recently found out how much work it actually is to put together these videos. And so if you can spare $1 or $2, please go to our Patreon and become a patron. As I said, any of us would really appreciate it. It'll help us to actually continue to make this, these analyses videos. And, hit us with a follow on Twitter, either at OtakuTariat or at Anime Ramblin' Boys. We want to talk to y'all. I want to talk to y'all. It's quarantine. I'm lonely. Please come talk to me. And with all that stuff said, I think it's time we get to some analysis, y'all. So let's make that happen. The meaning of the word trauma is contested, but in my personal vocabulary, trauma refers largely to an emotional or psychological wound, an injury to our immaterial sense of self. If we accept that two important features of human existence are our ability to make decisions about the content of our lives and our ability to establish, maintain, and develop relationships with each other, then trauma emerges as a disruption and deviation of our basic humanity. Trauma is marked by a short-circuiting of our sense of autonomy, our ability to prescribe and follow our own rules of conduct. Trauma is also characterized by a disturbance or disordering of our past, present, and future human relationships. When you combine these two aspects, it becomes clear that trauma is connected to a form of power. The power that some have to deny another person's autonomy. To wield this kind of power over someone, one does not have to be particularly close to them. However, proximity does matter, as it is those people closest to us, both spatially and relationally, who are most able to encourage or deny our autonomy. Consequently, it is those closest to us, our deepest friends or beloved family members, who are often able to inflict the most devastating forms of trauma upon us. At the start of our story, Hitagi Senjohara is a high school girl who has chosen to repress her emotions and memories rather than confront her own trauma. Although we don't learn this until the second episode, in the transitional period between middle school and high school, Hitagi was sexually assaulted by a high-ranking member of her mother's cult. In the aftermath of this attempted rape, after her family was splintered by the actions of her mother, Hitagi encounters this heavy stone crab, an emotion god that is known for stealing the weight of its victims. Her ensuing weight loss is both literal and metaphorical, as at the beginning of our story, Hitagi's physical weight has not been wholly eliminated but is reduced from 45 kilograms to 5 kilograms, indicating that she is not weightless but rather weighted less. This predicament, like all of the predicaments that affect our main cast in Bakemonogatari, lends itself to a comment on the nature of genre in this story. Bakemonogatari is a fantasy in the sense that Sevaton Todorov defines this literary genre. That is to say, it is a story whose artistic form, characters, and world are defined by a continuous back and forth between the realism of a rationally explainable world and the supernaturalism of a world whose laws defy human comprehension. In this fantastical story, weight at a symbolic level represents Hitagi's emotional and psychological burden, the baggage of her memories of her mother, her bond to the person who caused her an extreme amount of pain. I have no weight, I have no dignity, absolutely no dignity, she tells our main hero, Koyomi Araragi, in one of the first few scenes of episode 1. While showing that trauma is an affront to dignity, this quote also hints at the fact that Hitagi's strategy for coping with her own trauma has arisen out of a sense of shame rather than autonomy, that the repression of her trauma has not assuaged but only magnified. Hitagi has chosen to run away from her trauma, to retreat into weightedlessness rather than to acknowledge and take ownership of her pain. In doing so, she has plunged herself into the kind of rabbit hole that often leads others towards self-destructive behavior, and, in the extreme, psychological and even physical death of self. Denial, displacement, projection, these are defense mechanisms that human beings develop in response to traumatic events. Their manifestation is often accompanied by the adoption of personally harmful patterns of thought and forms of behavior, be they substance or drug addiction, supremacism, or abusiveness towards ourselves and towards others. Why do I call the end of this process death of self? Well, because of autonomy and relationships are of paramount importance to the self, and to deny or destroy either or both is to deny or destroy the self, and sometimes these forms of self-abnegation can lead to great self-harm or even suicide. The end of Hitagi's story is not quite so extreme, but it is only so because of two main reasons: the relationships of support and mutual accountability that Koyomi, and to a lesser degree Oshino Meme, form with her, and her own self-driven decision to confront her trauma head-on and accept it as an irrevocable part of herself. Pretty much from the jump, her relationship with Araragi-kun is defined in terms of his almost instinctual decision to intervene to save and then help her, at first by catching her from a nasty fall down a spiral staircase. Her reaction to this event, through which he is able to persevere, consists of her lashing out at him, pleading with him that he not attempt to probe further, threatening him with violence should he insist on pressing forward, and physically wounding him in the infamous staple scene. Despite this, and perhaps because of his own traumatic past as well as his vampiric healing powers, Araragi-kun is able to insist on helping Hitagi, and after persuading her that he may be able to assist her, he convinces her to partially let her guard down and follow him to the abandoned construction area where the spiritual guide Oshino Meme resides. There's a brief note to be made here about the meaning of Hitagi's stationery. As we know, but cannot always see, her body is completely covered with stationery. Her pens, paper clips, scissors, and most famously staplers represent both her physical defense mechanisms and her psychological defense mechanisms. The stationery that Hitagi carries is symbolic of the walls that she has built around her heart, those mental barricades that she has willingly erected to prevent herself and others from getting too close, so that she cannot hurt them and so that they cannot, like her mother, hurt her. Yet ultimately, it is these mental blocks that curtail Hitagi's autonomy and prevent her from building meaningful human relationships that could help her come to grips with and grow as a person from her trauma. It is only fitting then that before she is allowed to meet with Oshino, she is told by Araragi-kun that she must abandon her stationery at the door. She must leave behind her defense mechanisms before proceeding, because Koyomi can't let Oshino meet someone who's dangerous. This implies that there is a certain danger that accompanies the absence of vulnerability, and that a willingness to let oneself and one's pain be seen by other people is essential to resolving trauma. And so the girl who initially dropped her stationery to the ground after her second conversation with Araragi in the school hallway does so once again in a foreign environment of an abandoned construction zone littered with danger warnings. As we will later see, however, this scene does not represent a full discarding by Hitagi of her mental barriers, as she gestures to and stating that she is still on guard and ready to strike if need be. If the road to resolving trauma is long, full of hard steps that must be diligently followed to arrive at peace of mind, the journey to and conversation with Oshino at the construction site encapsulates some of these difficulties. Koyomi and Hitagi's first challenge is an elevator that is broken. The easy route of taking this elevator being foreclosed forces our main characters to step off the beaten path. I like to think of this road less traveled, cluttered as it is with exit signs, as symbolic of the drudgery but also the grace that must be afforded to one dealing with trauma through its presentation of a difficult path and its inclusion of several off-ramps. It is electing to follow this path that in turn elicits a confession from Hitagi about the impact of her trauma, as she tacitly reveals her perceived lack of self-worth to Koyomi. Justifiably skeptical of Koyomi's intentions in bringing her to this construction site, Hitagi states to Koyomi that she is not worth raping. First, Koyomi half-jokingly attributes this remark to Hitagi's persecution complex. However, its validity is tellingly acknowledged by Hitagi right as they near Oshino. Calling Oshino an unconventional spirit guide would be a bit of an understatement. Covered from head to toe in upside-down crosses, Oshino's garb somewhat contradictorily connotes both spiritual humility and anti-religious sentiment. His choice of outfit is on the one hand reminiscent of symbolism associated with Peter the Apostle, who famously requested to be crucified upside down as a testament to his unworthiness before Christ. At the same time though, Oshino's outfit connotes anti-religious sentiment by conjuring imagery associated with the contemporary view of upside-down crosses as anti-Christian. He himself is identified by Koyomi as a specialist. He is one who deals with people possessed by apparitions, in other words, by those who have been traumatized. As such a specialist, his first conversation with Hitagi is striking, as he rejects her wish that he quickly solve her problem and instead advises her that she must save herself while identifying her complicity and not having already done so. One match leads to fire, meaning that one small act may lead to a catastrophe. This refrain is written outside of Hitagi's shower, and it is first shown as she cleanses her body in holy water, in preparation for the purification ritual that Oshino has put together for her. It is ironic then that in the scene that follows, purity and profanity intermingle through sexuality. A recurring theme in Bakemonogatari is that sexuality is a fundamental aspect of our humanity, that sexual expression and our sexual drives color our thoughts, actions, and motivations. Accordingly, Hitagi brandishing her sexuality through the naked display of her body to Koyomi stands as a physical expression of her vulnerability. Though imperfectly, Hitagi is willing to let Koyomi in, allowing him to understand that it was her mother's decision to allow a cultist to sexually assault her that marked her transition from youthful innocence into the sobering awareness of adulthood, as she watched her family, her self-worth, and her willingness to be intimate with other people implode and crumble away into near nothingness. Jokes about their respective virginities aside, this moment marks Hitagi's willingness to move past the faults of her past as much as it acknowledges the persistence of her self-imposed barriers. In spite of being told by Oshino to change into pure clothes, symbolizing vulnerability, she elects to dress herself in undergarments covered with stationery, showing that she has not yet shed her defenses. If the sexual assault facilitated by Hitagi's mom was an attack on her daughter's sexuality by a cultist, it was also a strike against Hitagi's view of religion and spirituality. Religion and spirituality are not the same thing. Religion is an organized form of spirituality. It is spirituality with the weight of dogma, while spirituality refers to the deepest values and sets of meanings by which people live, which does often include an opinion affirming the existence of one or multiple deities. In our world, as well as in the first arc of Bakemonogatari, religion and spirituality tend to go hand in hand, meaning that the perversion of one can quite easily lead to the souring of one person's perception of the other. It is such a souring that leads Hitagi to adopt a distorted view of spirituality, to adopt, tragically enough, the kind of escapist behavior that led her mother to self-destruction and the commission of moral harms against her family. It is the perversion of morality by a form of organized religion that preys upon the weak that leads Hitagi's mom to the heinous act of allowing the virginity and innocence of her daughter to be sacrificed. What this immoral action shows is that religion and spirituality, if unmoored from material conditions, can, as it does for Hitagi's mom, devolve into a sort of escapist theology, a doctrine that enables one to flee from reality rather than confront its difficulties. Such a theology may and often does hold this world in contempt as profane and irredeemable, but in doing so, it tends to open the door for sacrificing the things of this world to the divine. For Hitagi's mom, escapist theology leads her to distortedly sacrifice herself, her daughter, and her family to a predatory cultist, all in the name of a ritual with a purpose that ostensibly transcends morality. The problem is that any religious system like this misses one of the main points and roles of religion and spirituality as features of the human world. In forsaking an earthly ethics, such escapist theologies lead us astray from our moral agency, one of the traits that, at least according to the Christian tradition, distinguishes human beings from animals and puts us closer to God. We can sit here and argue about the meaning of the book of Genesis, though I'm agnostic, so I personally won't spend too much time doing so, but one of the things that fascinates me about the story of Adam and Eve is that it is the acquisition of knowledge about good and evil that leads to the expulsions of humans from the Garden of Eden. It was our procurement of moral agency and our curiosity for knowledge that consigned us to an earthly, mortal fate of toiling for our food and of alienation from the divine. Paradoxically, however, along with immortality, moral agency is also painted as a godly trait in Genesis, as linked to one of the two divine fruits in Eden. So at least through a Christian lens, the abandonment of our moral agency for a form of organized religion seems to be a particularly egregious error. It is the kind of error or sin that in our story leads to Hitagi's mom using religion to exercise power over or dominate her daughter, traumatizing Hitagi and leading her to adopt a similar form of escapism as an escape hatch from the problems of her past, although it only comes to light as a result of the initially violent response of the crab god summoned by Oshino's ritual. The course of action first chosen by Hitagi to deal with her trauma tragically mirrors the relationship her mother developed with the cult. As we later find out, Hitagi's decision to form a compact with the crab god to eliminate her memories and her feelings for her mother was her own form of turning towards spirituality as an escape. In this way, Hitagi sacrificing her way to the crab god becomes a means, albeit an ineffective one, of fleeing from the moral harms occasioned by her mother. I say ineffective because as Hitagi confesses to Oshino at the start of the ritual, she feels a sense of survivor's guilt about having retaliated against her assaulter, and afterwards about having watched her mother be penalized by the cult and seeing their home life and her relationship with her mom obliterated. Still, as Oshino states, if these are Hitagi's feelings, then regardless of how heavy these feelings are, she must accept and continue to live with them. This is where Hitagi has so far failed. Rather than accepting and working to overcome her trauma, she elected to use spirituality in the same way that her mother did, as an escape mechanism. Once the bond composed of affectionate feelings and the promise of protection that linked Hitagi and her mom was shattered, Hitagi plunged herself into a place of shame, guilt, and isolation. Instead of taking the hard road of leaning on her relationships and using her autonomy to deal with her trauma, Hitagi chose to displace her literal weight along with the weight of her memories and feelings onto an emotional god she encountered on a fateful afternoon several years ago. And yet, as the 5 kilograms of weight that remained after her encounter with the crab god suggests, this course of action did not offer a solution for Hitagi's problems. This is because in seeking to repress and displace her feelings through spirituality, Hitagi's actions ended up not being all too different from those of her mother. After all, Hitagi's mom had originally joined the cult in an act of desperation, probably as an attempt to find meaning and/or run away from reality at a time when it looked like middle school Hitagi was going to die, either from physical illness or from the high-risk surgery required to cure it. It was the veritable deus ex machina of Hitagi's recovery that validated her mother's blind faith in her religion. The same blind faith that eventually led her to act immorally through unquestioning acceptance of the perverse desires of the high-ranking cultist. It is ironic that Hitagi's choice to use spirituality in a similar manner led her to commit similar moral harms. Rather than being vulnerable and accepting the help of others, Hitagi chose to wall herself from other human beings, or still to actively displace and project her feelings and traumas onto those who ventured to assist and support her. Hitagi's failure to recognize her own complicity in not resolving her trauma and its manifestation through her domination of herself and of others is in my view a compelling lens to understand why Oshino's ritual fails at first. To summon the emotion god, Hitagi is asked to offer information that can be used to personally identify her. She is asked to present basic facts of her identity, her birthday, her favorite book, what it felt like to move from middle school to high school, just as she is asked to share her most painful memory, being nearly raped and having to use the spike shoe to defend herself. Her ability to be vulnerable and to answer these questions is what allows the crab god, the specter of her trauma that only she can see, to be summoned. Yet though Hitagi is able to testify about her trauma to others, it is a far more difficult task for her to make the decision to confront her trauma. And though she is unable to do so at the beginning stages of the ritual, to pray that the crab god gives her weight back, leading it, a manifestation of her trauma, to physically lash out at her, she is eventually able to do so. After admitting that she was too scared to face the crab, she courageously begs for her weight back. She opens herself up wholly, cries, and uses her imagination and memory to empathize with her mom and reframe her actions. It is by understanding the error of her own actions and the value of others that Hitagi recovers the weight of her past and gains a friend in Koyomi, who, in a fitting nod to one of the overall themes of this arc about trauma, ends up bearing her weight in addition to his own when he weighs himself in the final scene. So what are some of the overall thematic messages of this arc? First and foremost, if trauma is seen as the outcome of a denial of autonomy and of the severing of relationships, then willing to embrace both of these features of our humanity can be perceived as a possible route for coping with our issues in a manner that is self-constructive rather than destructive. Second, religion and spirituality in the form of escapist theology can be distorted to serve the ends of escaping from or displacing our problems onto others rather than facing them with the people who are closest to us. However, as the unconventional spiritual guide Oshino shows us, these two features of the human world can also offer us a path out of hopelessness, guilt, shame, despair, and isolation. This can happen when our quest for meaning is able to remain grounded in the concreteness of the material conditions we experience on a daily basis, as well as in the human relationships that keep us tethered to the world around us. Does that require the practice of a sort of faith, or more broadly an ethics that strives to maintain a bit of distance from dogma, institutions, and ideology? I can't answer that for certain, but I do think it's interesting that Oshino is not a priest. That is, someone tied to a specific temple, faith, or religious institution. He is someone who studies and practices theology for his own ends. What those are, I don't really know at the moment, but what I do know is that at least in Bakemonogatari, Oshino's spirituality is practiced in a way that is helpful to people like Hitagi Senjohara and Koyomi Araragi. It is a system of thought and conduct that helps the traumatized to heal.